Okay, welcome. Now I have to just get the CVN people to start recording something for a second. Yes. Great. Okay. All right, let's go. Welcome, I'm Dan Ellis. This is Music Signal Processing, LN E4896. And let's see, got some technical issues here because I'm first time I taught in this classroom and it's the first time in a while that I've taught on CVN. Oops, thank you. There we go. Okay, is that good? All right, let's see. Yes, okay. So this class is it's being taught on the video network, which means that it's being recorded at the same time as we're watching it. And but just I'm trying to find my way around. There's a bunch of different pieces here. I have this remote control, but I've got a funny feeling it doesn't work at the moment. Yeah, okay. I'll sort this out for next time. But okay, so this class, Music Signal Processing. I taught it this time last year, and when I taught it then, it was like the first time I taught it. The class was actually created a few years ago by Professor Alexandros Eleftheriadis, who used to be in the department. And he was his sort of area was multimedia communications, but he was also a very keen amateur musician and did a lot of music production. And so he had this idea that you could teach a lot of interesting principles of signal processing through the use of music and looking at music technology. And so I thought that was a great idea. And so I picked up the class last year, but I kind of reworked it to pull in a few other ideas that I'd had about how to do it. And in particular, the big thing that I really that was possible to do was this idea of having the experience of using these technologies be very interactive. And that by working with music, we have an opportunity to take signal processing and to really connect it with our intuitions, because we can use these real-time applications where you can basically twiddle knobs, right? You can build an algorithm and you can run it and you can adjust it in real time. And this was something I'd sort of never been that enthusiastic about, because it's, typically you have an algorithm, it works, and then you try and make it run in real time, and it's like 10 times as much work, and it does the same thing at the end, it just does it in real time. But basically what had happened while I wasn't paying attention was the technology had matured, so that now it's actually not that much harder to make these things run in real time. And the internal experience of being able to experiment with these things interactively is just so much more, has so much more impact, gives you so much more insight and educational benefit, that this is a very, very exciting opportunity, I think. So that's kind of like the basic philosophy here, where we're interested in signal processing, so we're interested in the basic things you can do with signals. We're looking at the applications in the music area, which is an important and current area. There's a lot of innovation and recent developments in this area, a lot of things you can do. It's a commercially important area at the moment. But it gives us this opportunity to work with signal processing in an interactive, in a hands-on, in a practical manner. And I think that's has a qualitatively different kind of educational experience from the more traditional kind of book study, theoretical analysis. So we'll still try and include some of the theoretical analysis, but we're always going to try and connect it to these practical aspects. So that's the basic kind of backstory to this course. And what I want to do today is just tell you a little bit about the details, the structure of the class, so you can know what to expect. And then we'll just cover briefly sort of a 1 or half-hour review of digital signal processing, sort of the entirety of the class I taught last semester. So any questions about that before we start? So this last year when I taught it, there were, I think, 20 students. So it's a few more now, maybe pushing 30 here, which is a good size. I wouldn't want it to get any larger than this. I would very much, well, you'll see. We're going to structure the class to try and make it interactive. Certainly not just straight lecturing, nothing like that. So, but hopefully it will become obvious. But you're certainly totally invited and will be kind of obliged to speak up in class, one way or another. Okay, so we're talking about music signals. I can turn these lights off. Hang on, let's see if I can turn the blackboard lights off. Unfortunately, I never learned to teach with a blackboard, and I can't do it. And so we're limited to using this. We'll explore other things if necessary, but I'm not going to use these. So we're talking about music. So let's play some music. And so this is sort of not a particularly relevant example, but it's a nice example. Let's see.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged the comb across my head. Found the way.
So I expect most of you recognize that as The Day in the Life by the Beatles. Sort of the big sort of central pivot. The reason I chose that example, a couple of reasons. One is it sort of underlines the richness of the signal that we're dealing with. Right? There are quite a large number of instruments playing. There's like this orchestral build, and then there's some voices, and then there's drums and piano and some other spot sound effects, the alarm clock ringing. The other reason I chose it is because we do actually have, it turns out that somewhere along the line, the 4-track master. So this was, 1968 in Abbey Road Studios, and they were just beginning to experiment with multi-track recording. And so it was actually, the final version is recorded on a 4-track, but we have the 4-track original. So this is the actual 4-track of that here. And so if we play this. Listen to the individual tracks here, which is just like the most amazing experience that you can listen to some iconic piece and take it apart. Which is not to say that we're going to do very much of that, because that situation where you've got the 4 tracks is very rare. But it does remind you that these sounds are built up very carefully out of many individual sources, and the overall effect is something that's very delicately constructed, using a combination of, the technology that makes it possible to manipulate and modify these sounds, and then sort of the artistry that guides the producers and the musicians to what they actually want to try and produce. And so that's kind of, the interface that we're working at here. Music signal processing is only worthwhile insofar as music is an interesting thing. And that's kind of a whole can of worms of what's interesting about music and what we want to do if we want to make music. Of course, we're not going to get into that, but that's kind of this sort of elephant in the room for everything that we're doing here. Okay. All right. So the course goals. It's basically going to. We can't cover everything about music signal processing in a single class because it's just simply too broad a topic. So it's going to be more of a survey class where we look at a bunch of different areas and they'll be fairly broadly spread around. And the idea is to sort of give you a flavor for all these different areas and along the way to explore a few specific topics within that. So some of the things we'll be looking at, music synthesis, that's using signal processing to generate sounds, to generate musical sounds. Music audio processing, which is kind of the stuff you do in the studio, the modification of signals or the taking of the original signal and changing its nature to do something more interesting. And then music audio analysis. This is actually the main area that I'm directly involved with in terms of research. My group over in Shapiro, we work on audio analysis, including music audio analysis, so taking the signal and trying to get high level information out of it. So here we'll talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done. This is more, not particularly that expert, and you'll see there's plenty of stuff to look at. So, we're sort of coming at this, the other class I teach is digital signal processing. My sort of motivation is to educate, to provide the basic, foundational, theoretical material for signal processing, but the idea that we can use these musical examples to sort of really motivate it and cement it and make it much more relevant. And then, as I mentioned, the particular thing I really wanted to try and do with this class is to make it much more hands-on than, say, the class last semester. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be doing a bunch of live investigations where we actually, each of you gets to work on some kind of piece of code and try stuff out and play with these actual processing implementations. And we'll be using several different packages to do this: MATLAB, processing, and pure data. How many of you have worked in MATLAB? Yeah, I assume pretty much everybody, because it's kind of the platform of choice for signal processing. It's only here. How many of you have used processing? Okay, so just one, I think. Processing, we'll look at that in a second. It's this really neat language. It's basically Java, but it's Java with this encapsulation to make it incredibly easy to use. And I couldn't believe how powerful it was when I started using it. And PD, pure data, who's used that? Okay. Well, pure data, so that's just one again. Pure data is a very interesting and quite mature data flow language, graphical programming environment for sound processing. It's written by this guy, Miller Puckett, who is a professor at UCSD, but basically in computer music. And he's been writing it for the last 15 or 20 years. And it's just this way of moving these blocks around to make audio processing programs. But it's a very interesting experience, and again, it's incredibly powerful and interactive. Okay, so that's the general idea of what we're trying to do. Here's the sort of the details of how the course is going to be structured. We have 2 hour and 15-minute sessions on Mondays and Wednesdays. And the way I want to break this down is that on Monday we'll have something which looks kind of like this, like a traditional lecture, and then maybe some discussion or something like that. But on the Wednesdays, we won't have a lecture at all. What we'll do is we'll have we'll have a presentation, so we're going to have a series of student presentations. You all get to give a presentation, brief, 5-10 minutes, and we'll talk a bit more about that. The presentation, maybe some discussion of that, but the bulk of the time will be taken up with a practical. And every week what I'm going to do is I give you some piece of code, and then you get to play with it. We'll talk about that in a second. The grade structure, it's different from how I remember it. Okay, the components of the class are, there's a final project. The final project is meant to be a fairly significant, large piece of work. There are also 3 mini projects, which are basically these sort of fairly specific assignments, which we'll get at specific times during the semester. We have like a 2-week period to do it. You have to make a presentation at some point during the semester, one of these Wednesday sessions. And then we're giving a chunk of the grade for in-class participation. The point about this is we're going to be doing these practicals on Wednesdays. There isn't actually any kind of submission you have to do for that. It's just, you just have to come and participate. But in order to make sure that you do actually come and participate, you're kind of obliged to show up. And that's what this is just, this is the hostage we're holding to make sure that you do come and engage in that, because this is kind of like a big part of what we're going to do here. A big part of what you're going to learn is going to be hopefully the practical experience of working with these pieces of code on the Wednesday sessions. So there's no real assessment here. It's just if you come and do it, then you get the points. I'm not sure about these percentages. I guess if I put them up there like that, I should stick with it. I was going to put more on the final project just to sort of give you more incentive to work on the final project, but hopefully you'll have that anyway. So you'll see the homework component is not too severe. You know, there are these 3 mini projects in the final project. There's no weekly homework or anything like that. Because, you know, I think that I want you to have time to be able to experiment with this stuff. Hopefully that works out. Okay, so the practicals. You know, the essence of music signal processing is this kind of interplay between the things we can do objectively, quantitatively with the signal processing, and the musical effect, how it sounds, what impressions it gives us. And so it's very much this kind of this intuitive boundary that we need to become familiar with. And so the best way to do that is to be able to play with stuff, to actually try stuff out, be able to tweak parameters, be able to try different ideas out. Because it's not the kind of thing where you know what you want at the end. It's not like there's this single objective measure and we just have to bring it down, we can differentiate it, and we get, you know, the algorithm falls out. By its nature, we sort of don't know what we want in the end, in many cases. And so the best way to find out is through this kind of more free exploration. So the idea is that we'll meet in class on Wednesdays. There'll be some code which I'll announce introduce on Monday. And then you'll each bring along, or as many of you as can or as need to, will bring along laptops. You'll then work on this code on your own laptops during class time, where me and Young Sok, the TA, sorry, this is Young Sok, the TA, who's going to be helping out, he works with me this year. We'll move around and we'll talk to you and sort of, you know, see how you're getting on and help you deal with any problems you come up against. And then, you know, after about half an hour, we'll stop and we'll have people report back what they've experimented with, what they've found, and what their experiences were. And so it's more of, you know, a kind of group extreme coding exercise where we all work together, or sort of at least at the same place at the same time, and try stuff out and just see what we can do in a very short time. But with some, you know, by basically working with some code that already does something, we're trying to modify it, trying to experiment with it, see what we can find out. We'll be using these 3 different platforms. MATLAB, which you're familiar with, and I guess which you can all now get on your laptops through the site license that Columbia has. Processing, which I said is this Java environment for live programming. This is freely available from the processing.org website and runs on Macs and PCs and Linux. And Pure Data, this graphical programming environment, which is also open source, also available on Mac, PC, and Linux. And we should be able to get hold of that, install that. Processing, I had incredibly smooth time installing. Pure Data is a little bit more rough around the edges, but there's a large community out there of people who've worked with it, so hopefully you'll have no trouble getting it going. So the projects, there's the mini projects I described that basically, you know, they're sort of midway between sort of conventional homeworks and open-ended projects. There'll be some kind of specific framework that you're given, but then the actual assignment is rather more open-ended. You work with it, you try some stuff out, you write a brief report, and assess it. I'm not sure if we're going to use the same ones we did last year. I'll probably use the same one to begin with, but we might play around with these a little bit compared to what we did last year. So I haven't finally decided what it's going to be. There's the final project, and again, my philosophy here is that, you know, some of you may have taken this class because you have some specific thing that you're interested in relation to this area, and so the best kind of final project you can do is the one that, you know, maximizes how much of your personal motivation you can employ. So that I want to give you a free choice to do whatever project appeals to you. And then there'll be some process of iteration between us and you to figure out just the right topic, and it's not too broad, not too it's sufficiently well defined. The only limitation is that it has to be an actual implementation, and it has to be some kind of musical signal processing a music signal, so one way or another. And then at the end of the semester, you'll make a final presentation of the project, and then there'll be a report that we'll use to grade it. So the kind of projects I'm looking for, it's kind of important, and it makes a big difference to have a clear goal. Of course, that has to be tempered with what I was saying about the nature of music, where it's kind of difficult to have a very precise quantitative goal in some cases. But this is definitely the place to start. Obviously, I want you to be using some of the ideas we covered in class. And then, because this is engineering, after all, there is this idea of kind of iterative refinement, that you start off with a goal, you try something out, you then assess by some mechanism how well you did, and then you try and diagnose what happened, what didn't work the way you expected, where are the areas for improvement, and you can go back and try and improve it, try and make something better. Hopefully there's enough time over the time scale of the semester for you to do this at least once, maybe twice, to actually be able to improve what you're doing. And this is important. This is an important part of what I'm going to be judging you on. On this kind of project, I don't really want it to be it's not about whether you succeed in what you set out to do in the beginning, because, I don't want to push you into choosing projects which are kind of safe and conservative. I'd much rather you did something that was kind of ambitious and difficult, and you don't know whether you're going to succeed. And then, of course, if that happens and it doesn't work out for whatever reason, I'm not going to penalize you just because you didn't get where you wanted to go. Rather, I'm going to look at how you were able to intelligently diagnose what happened, to look at what you did and argue for why you did its own thing, and then maybe figure out why it didn't do exactly what you thought, and then how intelligent you can go back and try and improve it. So that's what I'm looking for. And again, as a result, it's a little bit different. Rather than necessarily wanting you to produce at the end of this something which looks like a standard academic publication, I would be happier, or at least certainly as happy, to get something which is much more narrative, which is much more sort of a diary of what you did and why. We have this kind of, the convention in academia is you sort of write this paper as if everything sort of just emerged fully formed out of your head, which of course is never the way, but we tend not to discuss it that way. But here, I'm really interested in your thought process and your analysis process. So I'm happy for you to write it and present it that way. So some examples of projects that people did last year. Here are 3 examples. Jason Sherrod did a project on beat tracking. He took a description of the beat tracking algorithm, one of the ones we can cover in class, and implemented it in pure data. And actually, interesting, because it's one of the most, this is Eric Shirer's cone filter beat tracker, which is one of the most widely cited beat tracking algorithms. But he actually found that there were some pretty serious problems in how it worked, which he came up with some ideas of how to improve it. This is a project on genre classification. It was done in MATLAB, where a student took a set of 100, there's this existing database by George Zantakis of 100 tracks in 10 different genre classes, and we just took some standard feature representations, built some models, did some classification, but was able to do some experimentation with different feature sets. And this was a project on music transcription, which again built on one of the many projects that we did in class that tried to actually take a piece of music in and produce an actual, standard musical score display of it. Let me just see if I can show you some of those. So. This is processing, and we'll look at more of this at the end of the class. So basically this is the music transcription project, and so here's this window. There's quite a lot of stuff here. Okay, this is quite a complex thing, but it's only a few hundred lines of this. And then basically the beautiful thing about processing, you just basically have this one window, this one set of code. You click play, and it compiles and runs just like that. So first it plays the MP3 file it's working from, which is actually this synthetic piano. And then it plays back its analysis, it resynthesizes its analysis using just a sine time for each note. And then it draws up the actual, and the music notation, the notes and the found. So that was, running live. Now it did actually make a couple of mistakes. I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, but it, that's pretty cool for just, that's not that complex a system for not that much code to produce something like that. The pure data one. Let's see. Oh, I don't know if I have that. The MATLAB thing. So here it is. Basically, he's got this routine. We can run it here. It just means it's not so much to see with MATLAB. It's loading in the audio files, calculating features, building classifiers, and running classification. But we can plot the confusion matrix and label it, etc. So what we're saying here is that we've got these different music genre classes, and it's doing pretty well at correctly identifying each sample with the appropriate class, but it's making a few confusions. So it's confusing country with rock, and metal with rock, and hip hop with reggae here, and I think there's different confusions. But you get, you can then try different features out, try different things, see if you can improve that performance. So, I guess, I hope that gives you an idea of the kind of scope of the project we can do here. That it's actually, you can do some fairly complex and nice stuff with this. Any questions about any of that so far? All right, well, we can ask them later. So part of the course requirement is to make a presentation, and the idea is that you each make one presentation because we're going to, as part of your grade. There'll be, at the beginning of the Wednesday sessions, we'll aim to have 2 or 3 a week, depending on how many students stay with us. So they'll have to be sure that they don't know how much time to work on. And basically, you can, again, this can be open-ended on whatever topic is most comfortable for you. You could find a paper that's interesting to you that you want to read and then present the main results. You could you can make a presentation of some coding you've done, either as part of the practical or as part of a mini project. There's no time for everyone to present their results from mini projects, but if you do something that you're particularly interested in, it would be nice for people to be able to share that. And if you're doing something else that's not particularly connected with, if you're working on a project that's not specifically part of the class, but which is relevant to the class, and you want to make a presentation about that, that would be great too. And obviously, if you are stuck for an idea of a topic for presentation, then we're happy to help you find something suitable. Because this has to be scheduled, we're going to allocate time slots, so you need to book your time slot because we're going to, we can't can't have more. If we don't do this, then it ends up with something that's like 3 weeks at the end of class and no presentations. So please try and sign up for these as soon as possible, and try and schedule a date as early as possible, just so we can make sure that everyone gets in. In terms of assessing the presentations, so last year I had concerns from some students who felt like, they were going to lose points on this because maybe they weren't native speakers or whatever, they weren't comfortable making presentations. That's okay. We're not about judging people on whether they can make a good presentation, because obviously that's a skill needs to be developed. We're grading more on effort here, but there are a few things that I want to see you try and do. One is, the basic point of presentation is not to do something that's necessarily incredibly elaborate or incredibly beautiful. The basic idea is to take an idea and transfer it to your audience. So it's about communication. It's about whether you can explain something clearly, and very often, in order to do that effectively, you have to strip it down. You have to make it, you have to reduce the scope of what you're trying to do. You're just trying to make sure that the audience comes out knowing something that they didn't know before. The other thing is, I would be very happy for you to have presentations that encourage discussion. So after each presentation, we'll have a few minutes to sort of ask questions and have a discussion. And the more successful, the more engaged everyone is in that, the happier I am. Again, you can't force that to happen. And some topics are intrinsically more kind of people are happier to share their views on than others. But this is definitely something we're shooting for here. We'd like to try and achieve. And that's also, although it's separate from the sort of formal scheduled presentations, there's also these sort of impromptu presentations that I want you to make after the practicals. So we'll be doing the practicals, in small groups, in pairs or threes or something. Different people will, go different places with the practical. At the end of like half an hour or so, we'll have a kind of report back session where each group gets to say something about what they tried or what they discovered, and then that'll be, again, kind of possibly something you haven't had a lot of experience with, sort of a completely spontaneous ad lib presentation to a medium-sized group of what you've just done. And again, I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable, put you on the spot, but I'm hoping that we can make the atmosphere sufficiently informal and supportive that people will be comfortable doing that, because I think that's, again, it's going to really help the benefit of the whole experience if you don't only get to know what you went through when you're trying to do this, but you also get to hear what other people found out. They're working on exactly the same stuff that you're working on, so you understand their context, but they maybe found out different stuff, and so we can really leverage the whole activity like that. So the class, I have a website for the class. Let's just look at that. It's just, if you go to my homepage, then it's just right here. And then basically it has all the materials related to the class. This is just the front page, just has the stuff we talked about here, the basic goals and stuff. And then there's a course outline here that gives the schedule of all the lectures and practicals that we're going to do. Right now, the slides that I'm using are linked here to the outline. Currently, for every class except this one there, the slides from last year, but mostly I'm planning to use the same slides, and I'll update them, but they'll give you a pretty good idea what we're going to cover. There's a tab here for code, and then when I do something in class that uses some code, I'll make sure the code is available here so you can download it and run it for yourself. See that later on. There's a page for the practicals. So every week we'll do a practical which will involve running some code, and the code will be distributed through this page. So this is, just now, if you looked at the slide before today, you could see the entire set for the whole semester because I left them all up from last year. Now, just to sort of help, to help you navigate I've hidden the ones that we haven't got to yet. I'm not trying to keep them secret or anything, just so that, now when you look at this, the one at the top is always the one that is current, the one we're going to be looking at. But there are a bunch of other ones that are all set up, and if you're interested, I can show them to you. The assignments, again, this is where the mini projects are going to get assigned. And right now I've put up this first mini project, which is the same as last year, just so you can see what it's going to be like. Don't start on it yet. I'm not sure if I might modify it before we actually do it, but that's the basic kind of flavor of what we're trying to do. This bottom tab here just links you through to Courseworks. I'm not going to be using Courseworks much because I've got my own website, but one thing that they have on Courseworks, which I don't have on this website, is the discussion board. So I've turned on the discussion board, the discussion forum in Courseworks, and that you can use that to have discussions about the class material, either discussions where you can post and other students can respond, or me and Byung-Suk will respond as appropriate to answer questions about material in the class. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. So this is the outline. This is basically a summary of what it has on the website. Basically, we have 12 or 13 different topics here, which are the things we're going to cover. So again, these are the Monday dates. And there's a lecture like 12 slides, something like that, just covering some key ideas in each of these topics. And then the following Wednesday, there will be some kind of practical related to this, where I actually run some stuff and try it out, relating to the topic we covered on Monday. These are topics I came up with when I was putting it together last year, and we kind of more or less ran as planned. But there are other things I could have included which are not there. If you have ideas about stuff, maybe you have expectations about what we might be going to cover and it's not here, let me know, because if it's, I don't claim that this is a comprehensive or final set of what's the most useful set of things. So I'm definitely open to suggestions of things that we could add to this or modifications we could make. The final class, this is because we're starting on Wednesday, the final class will be a Monday, where I don't particularly have anything planned for that. We can do some final project presentations, other presentations that we may not have gotten to, or I can talk about some work that's going on in my group, something like that. Okay, so that's kind of the presentation of the structure of the class. Any questions or points anyone wants to make? This class is experimental certainly in terms of this the practicals. I very strongly believe in the importance of doing that kind of thing, of actually trying stuff out, working with the code, and how that benefits in terms of making a connection between what you know intellectually and sort of what you expect it's going to do in the real world. But I'm not 100% convinced that this is the best way to do it. We'll see how it plays out in the practical sessions. One thing I found last year was, last year I was like creating these practicals on the fly, right? Each week I would be working on it, until the last minute to try and get something ready for class. And so one of the problems was there wasn't an opportunity to present the material, to give you a chance to look at the code before the class session. This year around, because we've now got those practicals in place, I'll be able to introduce them to you on Monday, and then you'll have, if you have the chance, you'll be able to look at the code before we come to class on Wednesday, And so that'll hopefully allow us to use the time in class a little more efficiently. But, I'm very open to your help and feedback in terms of how best to structure that and how to make that stuff the most useful. So please, bear that in mind, that this is definitely a work in progress. So what I wanted to do for the last half hour here is just to quickly go over some basic material. Now, the class lists as a prerequisite digital signal processing, either the class that I taught last semester or something equivalent. I'm sure you've all gotten something like that. It's not like you won't be able to understand much of what we're doing without that, but it's nice that if we can just assume we've all got that basic vocabulary in common, so when we do talk about stuff, we can use those concepts. And the concepts I'm talking about are basically Fourier analysis, the idea that a sound can be broken up into frequency components, and that's an equivalent way of describing a signal. And of course, that's particularly relevant in sound. You can argue about why that's, where that comes from, but the most obvious link is the ear basically performs a kind of frequency analysis. A very simple view of what the ear does is it's a bunch of resonators, which are essentially bandpass filters, takes a sound signal, breaks it up into these different frequency bands, and then the brain gets different nerves connected to each of these frequency bands, gets some indication of the energy in different frequency bands. So in that respect, Fourier transform has this kind of analog to the brain's representation of sound. And so that's why it turns out to be a useful way of thinking about sound. So just in these few slides, I just want to quickly review what we basically covered in the whole of last semester, at least the first half of last semester, in signal processing. So we're dealing with digital signals. Sound itself is the variation of the air pressure. It's a one-dimensional function of time in its simplest form. So it could be like this blue line here. And then to deal with it in a computer, the usual thing we do is we quantize it. So we have a discrete set of amplitude levels, intensity levels, which we restrict it to. And then we sample it in time. So we can't store an infinitely dense, we can't represent a continuous function directly in a computer, because all we can do is store is a finite number of values. So instead, we just have a short sampling interval, and we record the intensity at the regularly spaced time samples. And this gives us a reasonable approximation for this underlying smooth signal, although the actual limitations of that are kind of involved, and that's what DSP is sort of investigating. So we have our sampling interval, t seconds, which means we have a sampling frequency of 1 over t samples per second, or 2 pi on t radians per second in angular frequency, big omega. The level quantization we can represent as a sort of an instantaneous mapping q of x, some quantization step epsilon times the sort of the rounded value, the integer value of x divided by epsilon. So that gives us the values that we can work with. So the key idea of signal processing, the idea of the Fourier analysis, is this initially this observation that if you can take a periodic signal, it doesn't matter what shape each individual period is, but we can construct it out of sinusoids, and suddenly get the sinusoids. So for instance, if we have a square wave like this, here are a set of sinusoids. So this green one is the sinusoid that has the same period as the underlying square wave. The square wave isn't actually drawn. The blue line is approximating the square wave. But here's the green one is the fundamental. The sinusoid's frequency, or this period, is the same as the arbitrary underlying signal. And then here are these so-called harmonics. The red one is actually got 3 times the frequency, right? You can see in this half cycle in here, the red signal completes 3 half cycles. And then the cyan is 5 times, and sorry, magenta is 7 times, I guess. And if we sum up these 4 sinusoids, we get this blue line, which is still somewhat sort of smooth and sinusoid-like, but you can see it's tending towards approximating the square wave. And it turns out if we added more and more sinusoids at higher frequencies with the appropriate amplitudes and phases, then we can get arbitrarily close to the square wave that we're trying to get to. And so that's the idea of the Fourier transform. The Fourier transform is saying, well, I've got this time domain signal in a square wave, but I can represent it, I can construct it as a set of harmonics, and each harmonic has a particular phase, which in this case is, depending on where you draw the origin, it's cosine phase and sine phase. And they have amplitude. The amplitudes have to be right. In this case, for a square wave, the amplitudes go as 1 over n, and you can sort of plot them like this. So that's what we're saying here, mathematically. If x is periodic, meaning that x of t is equal to x of t plus some period big T, then we can approximate x as the sum of some finite or some countable set of sinusoids where we've got an amplitude for each one, ak, and here's the sinusoid. The generalized sinusoid of t, its frequency is k times 2 pi on t. So it's 2 pi on t is the angular frequency of the signal we started with here. So it's k times that, and then there's some phase. So basically, for each of these harmonics, where k is an integer, we have an amplitude, we have the sinusoid of that frequency, then we have a phase. And so the AKs and the phi k's are the Fourier coefficients that specify the particular waveform we're going to get. But with the appropriate choice of those, we can approximate with arbitrary precision any waveform that fits any periodic signal. And it's kind of, it's not obvious, and it's kind of powerful. So it gives us the Fourier transform. If we express it in the complex domain, mathematically it becomes a little simpler. So rather than having sinusoids, we have complex exponentials, e to the j, 2 pi k, on big T times t. So this thing is just cosine, the cosine we had before, plus j times the sine. So it gives us a way to tie up both phases, the full range of phases in a single complex number. We now include both negative and positive frequencies. That allows us to cancel out the imaginary parts by scaling the positive and negative going complex exponentials appropriately. And so now if we choose, we can have a CK. The CK is now a complex constant which embodies both the amplitude and the phase, both AK and phi k from the previous slide. So this is now a synthesis equation, and we're summing up these scaled complex exponentials, which are again drawn, they're a discrete set of frequencies which are integer multiples of fundamental. And then it turns out, well, what are these CKs going to be? We have this nice analysis equation. Because these things on these harmonics, which are integer multiples, are orthogonal, which means that if you take the inner product of one against another over an integral number of cycles, they cancel out. They don't have any inner product. They're orthogonal. You know what I mean? Because of that, we just take the inner product, the integral of the signal against each of the conjugates of each of these basis functions, and that gives us the appropriate coefficient for that. So this is like, not only can we build signals up, we can very easily find out what the appropriate coefficients are to build them. This is for a periodic signal. So we have a set of discrete coefficients, and the signal has to repeat every 2 seconds. But of course, we can let t get larger and larger. So we can say, yeah, it repeats, but the period of repetition is so long that you never actually see it repeat. The math is still going to work. And then what we can do, we can theoretically let t go to infinity, and everything stays the same. It's just now we have a description of how to do Fourier analysis that doesn't rely on the periodicity of the signal. It works for any signal without regard to whether it's periodic or not. The summation here becomes an integral, and so this multiples of this fundamental just becomes a continuous frequency variable omega, and these coefficients here now become a continuous function of a frequency variable. So this is, it's the same expression. It's just letting t go to infinity, basically. And similarly for the analysis, it stays the same. It's just that now instead of taking inner products against particular sinusoids and doing it over a single cycle, we're doing it over the entire time domain, and we're doing it against a continuously valued frequency variable. But it's the same idea. This equation written this way with equal signs here, these things are the same, so there's no particular, mathematically there's nothing special about one versus the other. And in fact, you notice that the equations are even pretty similar. There's this constant here, but that's just, basically, it's not very interesting. We could have put it anywhere in the loop. Apart from that, the equations look almost exactly the same. It's just that there's a minus sign in one of them. And then this is, we find this in terms of J omega, but that's for other reasons. And so there's nothing particularly special about the frequency domain compared to the time domain. Mathematically, they're basically the same thing. And this is kind of, and the reason we stress that is because clearly for us, they're completely different things. That's the sort of, the signal as it evolves in time, and there's a signal described as a set of sinusoids of different amplitudes. But that's just because we, as beings, we have a very special experience of time. But the math doesn't care at all. The math, it's like, yes, there's time, it exists. Yes, there's frequency, it exists. They have a relationship. They're basically symmetric. So it's kind of just a nice thing to point and to think about. So that's the basic idea for analysis. If we have a signal, if it's exactly periodic, we can express it as a set of discrete sinusoids. If it's not periodic, we can just express it as a kind of this integral over all sinusoids of all possible frequencies. Of course, the sounds we really care about are somewhere in between, right? That we're interested in periodicity in sounds because that basically gives us pitch in music. That's what musical pitch or voice pitch is. It's this sort of over a short window we have, a relatively local time window we have repeating periods. But they're not exactly periodic because then a little bit later they do change and they become something else. So we're interested in signals which are not quite periodic, but we are interested in their periodicity. So we're sort of interested in something which isn't quite covered by either of those extremes of the Fourier transform. But if over some region of the signal, x of t is approximately periodic, right? So it's more, it doesn't change that much. It's highly similar to itself shifted by a period in t, but might not be quite identical. But we can't express it as a Fourier series because it isn't exactly periodic. We can express it with its Fourier transform, the continuous Fourier transform. But what that's going to be is it's going to try and be like a Fourier series. What that means is we look at the Fourier transform, it's going to have big amplitude peaks around where those discrete harmonics would have been if it had been a purely periodic signal, if it had been a straight Fourier series representation. And this way, the Fourier transform is actually no different from the Fourier series. The Fourier transform, if you take the Fourier transform and calculate it for a purely periodic signal, you end up with a function x of omega. But what it is it's 0 for all omega, except for the omegas which are exact integer multiples of the fundamental, where it's a delta function in a certain way, where the weight is the Fourier series. So if you take an x which isn't quite periodic, which is close to periodic, you get a spectrum which is close to being the sum of these delta functions with the weights that would be given by the Fourier series. And so here's an actual example. This is a little chunk of a speech waveform. And a speech waveform, if you go ah, basically you have this cycle which repeats. But this is actually from a real word, and you see that it's maybe the end of the word, so the amplitude is dying out with time. This is, 60 milliseconds. We're seeing about 6 cycles. So the period here is about 10 milliseconds, which is typical 100 hertz for male speech. And you can see this repetition, but you can see it's not perfect. Okay, we take the Fourier transform of this. What we actually do is maybe pad it with zeros and take the discrete Fourier transform. But this is what the Fourier transform would look like. Now, it isn't a Fourier series, right? It isn't a set of discrete delta functions, but it does have these large peaks in here, and they are, in fact, regularly spaced at multiples of the fundamental down here, which are in 100 hertz. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So yeah, the 10th harmonic is here about maybe 950, so the fundamental is at 95 hertz. And so, this is what it means to be not quite periodic. You get something which sort of is recognizably kind of a slightly noised up, a slightly blurred out version of what we'd expect from a pure harmonic series. And this is more the kind of thing we're dealing with. This is maybe the kind of thing that at some level relates to what is perceived, what is experienced by the ear, and the kind of things we think about. To make this view, make this show up nicely, this is literally the pressure in micropascals or whatever, so voltage off a microphone that's directly proportional to pressure. These things are, the amplitude here is very different. Well, first I'm showing the magnitude of the spectrum, because of course the spectrum in general will be a complex number. I'm plotting the amplitude of it. But I'm plotting it in dB. dB is a log scale, 20 log base 10 of the actual values, I guess. What I'm actually plotting is 20 log base 10 of the absolute value of x of j omega. And what that means is, well, an order of magnitude, if y is log base 10 of x, then the log base 10 of 10 times x would be y plus 1. So 20 times log base 10 of 10 times x would be y, 20 times y plus 20. A difference of 20 in a dB scale is 10 times the amplitude. A difference of 40 is 100 times the amplitude. So what we're actually seeing here, this is a 40 dB range here between these large speeds and these smallest speeds. On a plot like this, you wouldn't be able to see it at all. Like the large one would be big, and the smallest one would be like a single pixel. But we use this dB scale so we can even see the detail over such a wide range of different values. Because it turns out, again, there are a number of reasons to do it. One, perhaps the easiest one to bring in is that it seems like the ear and other perceptual systems also have something which is close to a logarithmic scaling. And if you listen to this sound, these features up here, which are 20 dB, 1/10 of the amplitude of these low frequency features, they're every bit as important. They may even be more perceptually salient than these low frequency ones. So you definitely don't want to use a linear scale because you hide lots of detail, which is actually very important for the perception of sound. So we always use log plots for these signals. Okay, so I mentioned that, of course, we can't actually represent continuous value signals on a computer because of discrete notation. So instead we use these sample signals, x of n, where we just store the value of the continuous value at some every regularly spaced interval of bit t. And then it turns out that we can work out the Fourier transform for these sample signals. And basically we're doing the same thing there is only one underlying Fourier transform, but if you work it through and say, well, I've defined my signal as being these discrete impulses at specific time samples, and you can sort of simplify the expression for the Fourier transform, and you get the x of n. This is basically the same synthesis equation, but now we're only integrating over a fixed range of frequencies. We're using little omega for frequency. And the analysis equation, because x of n is a discrete sequence, we use summation to get the transform. It's basically the same equation. The impact of having these regularly spaced samples in time is that the spectrum now is constrained to be periodic. So little omega is radians per sample. It's normalized frequency. It's how the sinusoid of frequency little omega is how far along the sort of 2 pi baseline of the sinusoid, how far it goes for every sample that you get. By sampling only once every big t seconds, we end up being unable to tell the difference between a signal that went, like a tenth of a cycle in that one sampling interval, or that went a complete cycle plus a tenth, so 2 pi plus 2 pi on 10 radians in that sample. The way that sort of plays out is that if we have a spectrum, an x of e to j omega, that has a particular energy for a particular frequency, it's bound to have the same energy for a frequency which is exactly 2 pi larger. The spectrum is periodic at 2 pi. This is the magnitude, this is the phase. And so normally, of course, continues for negative frequency as well. Normally we only look at the spectrum between minus pi and pi, because everything else just repeats out after that. And the corollary of that is that the real world frequencies we can talk about are only over a finite range, and normally we restrict ourselves to the range which is between, from 0 to half a sampling frequency, 0 to the Nyquist rate. Because if we try and cover a range of frequencies that's wider than that, we end up getting Ellis, and we end up getting the same frequency showing up in different places. And so if we want to represent wideband signals accurately, we have to sample at a very high frequency, a very short sampling period, which makes sense. We have to record a lot of detail of how the signal is changing. So the Fourier transform, the DFT, the discrete Fourier transform here, well, what we defined before was the DTFT. We've got some signal of arbitrary length, we can calculate the Fourier transform for it. If we now say, okay, you know what isn't arbitrary length, it's a fixed length signal, we finally get something which we can actually talk about working with in a computer, and it's called the discrete Fourier transform. And it basically looks the same, it's just the analysis. Well, the analysis is the sum of the discrete signal multiplied by this W sub n, which is just a particular version of this complex exponential, the one that completes a single cycle in big N samples, where big N is the length of the signal we're dealing with. Now the synthesis, whereas before it was an integral, now, well, because we've only got this finite length of signal to deal with, there's only a finite number of spectral values we have to worry about, so this also becomes summation. And basically what this kind of amounts to is we're saying we have a fixed length signal x of n for n equals 0 to n plus 1, n minus 1. And it's as if we're assuming that signal is periodic in time, so it repeats indefinitely. So now we can describe it with a Fourier series, and so we only have to worry about these big N coefficients of the Fourier series x of k. But again, we have symmetry here. Both these equations are summations. They're both summations over big N point sequences. They're both being multiplied by this same complex exponential with a sign change, with a scaling coefficient here. That's not that important. Because this is just the sum of generating a big N point sequence by taking a set of weights against another big N point sequence, we can express this whole thing as a matrix. This thing is just a matrix multiplication with this particularly structured matrix, which is just different powers at W sub n. As powers repeat, which is why we can actually calculate it with a fast Fourier transform. But conceptually, all we're doing is calculating a matrix. This is the kind of thing that computers and, for instance, MATLAB is very well set up for. And so this is the kind of processing we can actually do, and this is at the core of a lot of what we actually do. So I'm going through all this kind of quickly and superficially, just so that we know that we're talking about the same thing, and that we are. The Fourier transform is not something which is just being pulled out of the air. It's something which you've seen before, something which we can actually explain right back to these basic sinusoids that we really understand. But the reason we're interested in it is because of this. It gives us this ability to analyze sounds. And so I mentioned before that the problem with the full Fourier transform is that it's if I take the Fourier transform of the signal, it says, okay, I've thrown away the time domain and replaced it with a frequency domain. I'm telling you the signal, which had some duration, is now being expressed as the sum of these individual sinusoids, which exist for all time. But that isn't really how we experience sounds. We experience sounds, yes, they have sinusoidal components, they have different frequencies, but those things change over time. And so we really want a representation which can do that, and that representation is the short-term Fourier transform. And so the idea is to come up with something that's like the Fourier transform, but only over relatively local windows in time. And it's a very simple idea. We take the signal, which has some arbitrary, maybe unlimited time base. We then have these short time windows, which we apply, and they pull out little chunks of the signal. So we can have one centered here, we have another one, take the next bit of time over here, another one for over here. We take out each of these successive windows, we then perform the Fourier transform on this, because it's a finite length discrete time signal, we just do the DFT, and we end up with this finite length spectrum telling us the energy of different frequency components in this local time window version of the signal. And then we can do that for each of these successive windows, and we get slightly different spectra. Probably these two, the way I've drawn them, they're overlapped. So 50% of the signal is actually the same between both of them. So the spectra is not going to change that much, but it's going to change a little bit because they're not identical signals. And as we move forward in time, we can get larger and larger changes depending on the structure of the signal. So we end up with this representation, this Fourier type representation signal, is now a function of two variables, a frequency index k and a time window index n. And what that is, we can define it as x centered around m times the length of the time window, the hop of the time window. So we have that, and then we have a windowing function, w of n, which is just this thing which is 0 for most values, but it's non-zero in its range, to pull out a certain values of samples. And then just the e to the minus j 2 pi kn or big N, which is just the discrete Fourier transform, w sub n to the minus kn. So we can define this thing, and now we've got a function which varies with both frequency and time, and is discrete, so we can calculate it on a computer. So we take our signal, we chop it up in these short windows, we take these Fourier transforms. We've now got this sort of problem. We've got these set of functions we want to plot. We'd like to sort of have a second, extra dimension to plot them in, so we can, rather than plotting them as, just offsets against y, we can use the grayscale image here. So now what was a large value is now a dark value, and here's the D code here. So it's showing values between minus 15 plus 10 dB as different colors. But now we have them in a set of individual columns. Plot like this, zoomed right in, we can see those individual columns, and they're very blocky. But if we sort of zoom out, so this is 300 milliseconds here, just a third of a second. But if we zoom out, so now we make it 3 seconds that we're looking at, and suddenly these sort of blocks merge together, they become indistinct pixels in this what appears to be a much more smooth image. And this is the spectrogram, which is this very powerful and popular tool for looking at the time-varying spectral content of sound. And so this is some speech, and we see that as the speech varies, the dark patches show us where there's energy. And we see that these individual blotches of the individual syllables or words in the speech signal with these white gaps, which are the pauses in between. But we also see that the different words have different distributions of energy across the frequency axis, and that's how we hear those different words because of their different spectral content. We can get different versions of the spectrogram. We basically have one free parameter in what we did, which was the length of that time window that we used. Right, we could have used a very, very long time window, chopped it up, taken the Fourier transform. We would have got lots and lots of frequency bands. We could have used a short time window and chopped it up very, very often into lots and lots of short windows. Each one of those short windows would have been a relatively short, small Fourier transform. We only got a few frequency bands. We would have got a lot more time cycles. And so it's basically a continuous knob. You can vary, and you get spectrograms which, again, we're still seeing the same basic blobs of energy, but we're seeing different things about them. With a long window, we get extra frequency resolution, and we can see these individual horizontal bands, which are the individual harmonics of the voice pitch. They're basically the Fourier series components that we're seeing. And you can see that there's a pitch variation here, right? This bending downwards is a variation in pitch. with a very short time, because this is a 256-point window of, I guess, 8 kilohertz. So that's a 32 millisecond window. This is a 48-point window, so it's a 6 millisecond window, much shorter. Now, the window is shorter than the 10 millisecond period of the voice, approximately 10 milliseconds. We can no longer see a complete cycle within the Fourier transform. We don't see these harmonics. But what we can see is these individual spikes that we can see in the time domain waveform, these individual pulses that are making up the harmonics here. And so you see there's sort of, you get much more time resolution, you can see the time structure, and you get a kind of different view of the signal. Neither of these representations is more correct than the other. They're both just different ways of looking at it. And it's because they're kind of trying to split the difference between time and frequency domain. There is no, you can't measure with arbitrary resolution in both time and frequency because they're not different, they're the same thing. It's a single signal, you can represent it in time, you can represent it in frequency, but you can't constrain it in both because they interact. But we can try and have this compromise between them, this time frequency local window, but you get different answers depending on what window you use. Okay, so I'm kind of running out of time here, but I wanted to show you, sort of to tie this back to what we're doing with the class. This is the calculation of a spectrogram in processing, and you can get this code off the website, but basically, it's less than 100 lines. And processing was not really built to do this. I didn't find anyone who'd done this before when I did this. I'm using an audio library that someone had written to actually grab the samples off the microphone, but the calculation of the spectrogram was just something that I did from scratch, and it was amazingly easy. And I've actually wanted to, for a long time I've been looking for code to do live spectrograms, and it's kind of something that wasn't widely available. It was kind of a specialized thing, but it was very easy to do. And so here, this is now that processing patch running, and you see that it's generating what looks like those spectrograms that we saw. So if I go, you can see the harmonics now. Can you see that? Yeah. Yeah. So if I go, you can see the harmonics moving around, and then the idea that what works in speech is the variation of the where the frequency emphasis is. You can do something like this, go and you can see these resonances moving around are actually the vocal tract resonances, the formants, which define the different speech sounds. And so that's gives you a very, very clear idea. And because it's just this code, we can go in here and we can change it. So we can just edit it like that. I've changed the window size maybe from 1024 points to 256 points. Try it, run it again. And now it's kind of, the frequency axis is messed up. But basically now we've got a spectrogram which is much more close to a wideband spectrogram using a short time window. And it was that easy to change. And of course we could have made it so it was parametric, something we had user interface control over. Okay, so that's sort of a little flavor for what we can do with processing and what we're going to be doing. Next week we'll be playing with processing in the Wednesday class. One thing I want you to do, actually just try this out over the weekend or before Monday, is to see if you can actually get processing working on your machine and see if you can run that live spectrogram sketch, just so you can sort of get into it. Okay, any questions? All right, I'll see you on Monday.